October 14, 1944, 03:30 hours. Port of Antwerp, Belgium. The German agent lay belly flat on the cold roof of a gutted textile mill, peering through a rain-slicked pair of Zeiss binoculars. He had seen American supplies unloaded before. He'd watched Liberty ships bleed crates and barrels into chaotic dockyards from Cherbourg to Salerno. Always the same: shouting, delays, confusion. Horses pulling overloaded wagons, crates stacked by hand, men dragging supplies through mud, boots sinking, back straining. But this was something else entirely. The moment the sun cracked the horizon, the warehouse across from him roared to life with an energy that looked choreographed. Dozens of boxy machines the size of small cars moved in formation, not tanks, not trucks, but squat beasts with hydraulic arms. The agent squinted. Were they lifting the entire pallets? A crate the size of a coffin was lifted, turned, and glided toward a waiting truck with the eerie grace of something mechanical, but not slow. The machine's operator didn't shout, didn't run. He sat comfortably in a metal seat, hands on levers, spinning the forklift on a dime. In less than 3 minutes, an entire pallet, 6 crates tall, 5 wide, was gone. And that wasn't the only one. Another forklift dove into the belly of a Liberty ship, emerged backwards with its load balanced perfectly, and passed it to a second crew that lined it onto a rolling platform. Crates clicked into place like ammunition into a magazine. The entire floor of the warehouse pulsed with movement. The agent adjusted his binoculars, unsure of what he was seeing. No whips, no shouting officers, no men sweating through rags. Only those machines and wooden skids the size of coffins, pallets, he realized, being slotted and stacked like puzzle pieces by American laborers who barely looked up from their task. It felt impossible. But it was real. The Americans weren't unloading cargo anymore. They were orchestrating it. He tapped his notebook. This is not a port, it is a weapon. By 04:12, he'd counted more than 100 forklift movements. A single shift had cleared an entire section of the warehouse floor. He'd watched a crew shift an estimated 80 tons of supplies, mortars, food, ammunition, tires, into formation without a single break. In German supply depots, such a job took days. Here it took hours. There were no oxen, no men hauling sacks up wooden ramps, no clattering of steel rails or manual cranes swinging wildly over uneven ground. Instead, there were rows of wooden pallets, lined with precision, each one carrying its own burden: medical crates from New Jersey, engine parts from Detroit, sea rations from Chicago. Everything labeled, everything sealed, everything stacked and accounted for. One crew member passed a clipboard to another, who nodded, tapped a metal rack, and like clockwork, a third man drove his forklift over, slid his tines into a crate the size of a Jeep engine, and drove off without a word. Not even the British moved like this. The German agent turned the page of his notebook, now wet with rain. He was trained to record logistics, count crates, estimate volumes, infer capacity. But what he was watching wasn't about crates. It was speed. It was precision. It was repeatability. And above all, it was modular. He scribbled furiously now, heart pounding. These weren't just forklifts. These were force multipliers. They turned dockworkers into technicians. One man with a machine could do what 20 Wehrmacht soldiers could do with ropes and splinters. A whisper of thunder rolled over the port. Not artillery, a plane. Above the warehouse, 2 C-47s banked into formation. The Germans knew them well, the workhorses of the American Air Force. But what they couldn't have known was that down on the tarmac, fresh pallets were being preloaded into rolling containers, each measured and matched to the C-47's internal bay dimensions. Load close, lift. And once airborne, the aircraft didn't circle. They didn't wait for escorts or clearance. They departed within minutes of touchdown, one arriving, one leaving. The German agent muttered aloud, unable to stop himself. "They've erased waiting." It wasn't just the forklifts. It was the fact that they were everywhere. He counted over 40 by dawn, darting like worker bees from ship to warehouse to airstrip. No two had the same paint job. Some bore serial numbers, others had hand-painted cartoons or city names on their flanks: Kansas Kate, Brooklyn Buck, Detroit Devil. This wasn't military standardization. This was American industrial chaos, chaotic, but devastatingly efficient. Every vehicle was different, yet they worked together without a pause. The floor layout was intuitive. Every operator knew their path. Crates moved on colored zones painted directly on concrete: red for munitions, blue for food, green for spare parts. There was no central shouting, no megaphones, just hand signals. He looked again at the forklifts, at the pallets, and he realized with horror this wasn't a miracle, this was deliberate. The Americans had planned this. They had trained for it, designed for it, built for it. By 0600, the warehouse he'd been watching was empty. Completely cleared. A convoy of trucks rolled out toward the front lines. The ship was already being reloaded. The next warehouse was beginning its cycle. And the same machines, the same wooden pallets and steel forks, repeated the process. The Germans had spies inside American units. They had studied the Garand, the Sherman, the Mustang, but no one had prepared for this. No one had prepared for a logistics war being won by wooden platforms and hydraulic arms. He wiped rain from his notebook and scribbled one last line. The Americans have taught their machines to move faster than men can think. The train arrived in Berlin under heavy cloud cover and blackout shades drawn. A courier stepped onto the platform with a sealed leather case shackled to his wrist, passed silently through the gauntlet of SS security, and vanished into a tunnel beneath the Reich Chancellery. At 04:45 the next morning, Oberstleutnant Martin Kruger sat with the decrypted report in front of him. Steam curled from his untouched coffee. His cigarette had burned to ash in the tray. He didn't move. The silence in the war room felt unnatural, broken only by the faint tick of a wall clock and the crinkling of the thin report pages in his hands. The report was supposed to be about port logistics, a routine summary of Allied material movements through Antwerp. But instead, it read like an autopsy of German assumptions. Forklift activity exceeds baseline projections by 600%. Estimated depot clearance time, 4.6 hours, subject was 15,000 crates. Secondary loading occurred without halt in convoy dispatch. American crews operate without command shouting, signals only. German countermeasures reliant on rail choke points ineffective. Kruger blinked at the line again. Forklift activity exceeds baseline projections by 600%. He tried to picture it, tried to imagine Wehrmacht depots in Poland moving 6 times faster than they already were, without horses, without rail delays, without men hauling crates in 3-man teams under rain and shellfire. But they couldn't. Germany was still moving like 1918. The Americans were operating in 1948. He read further. The pages were calm, clinical, terrifying. Estimated man-hour displacement. 1 American with pallet jack equals 18 German riflemen in manual labor equivalency. The numbers weren't just lopsided, they were absurd. Every sentence drove the same point home. The Americans weren't just faster, they had eliminated friction. And friction was the only thing Germany had left. Kruger folded the report slowly. There were men in uniform upstairs, older officers who still spoke of honor and fields of battle and encirclements, but there would be no flanking maneuver to undo this. No Stalingrad miracle. The Americans had turned warehouses into weapons and forklifts into artillery. There was no countermeasure, just the cold realization that the battlefield had moved behind the front. By 0600, the Reich Main Security Office had quietly updated its internal intelligence threat reports. Forklifts were given their own code category, Mechanized Logistical Multipliers Class 2. But no one knew what to do with that information. In Aachen, Colonel Franz Reinhardt was still trying to requisition 200 oxen to pull munitions crates to the Siegfried line. In the Ardennes, engineers waited on wooden wheels for their field wagons. The hubs had frozen in transit. In Bastogne, a Panzer Grenadier unit had gone 3 days without resupply because the rails had been bombed, and no one had planned for truck convoys over ice-slick forest trails. Meanwhile, in Belgium, the Americans were moving literal tons of supplies per hour. They weren't asking the same questions. They weren't even fighting the same war. Lieutenant Edward Slick, Mal, didn't know anything about German intelligence reports. All he knew was that his crew of 8 men had just emptied 3 entire Liberty ship holds in under 5 hours and stacked everything onto green-tagged pallets for the 5th Armored's advance east. He leaned against his forklift, sweat cooling against the December air, and grinned. His men called the machine the Mule. She'd been shipped in pieces and reassembled in less than a day. Now she ran 12 hours without complaint. "You see that turn I made?" Mal said to his loader, who tossed him a rag. "Barely 6 inches clearance, slid her in like butter." "You and that damn mule," the loader grunted, wiping his hands. "One of these days she's gonna roll over and squash you." "Not likely," Mal said. "She loves me." Beyond them, the dock teams kept moving, forklifts humming, pallets rolling, clipboards being checked without shouts, without salutes, just hand gestures and nods. There was no officer barking orders. There didn't need to be. The process ran like a song they all knew by heart. Trucks backed in, crates slid aboard, tailgates slammed, engines roared. Another convoy departed before the sun rose. An entire warehouse was emptied before Malloy had even opened his second cigarette. He leaned on his elbow and watched it unfold. To him, it was just the job, but to a German watching through binoculars, it looked like sorcery. In Cologne, a captured German logistics officer was handed photos taken from a downed reconnaissance balloon, aerials of Antwerp's Zone B depot. He examined the shadows cast by the forklifts, measured the gap between warehouse doors, tried to calculate clearance height on the transport trucks. "Why so interested in forklifts?" the British interrogator asked. The German officer didn't answer right away. He tapped one photo with a finger. "Because that," he said quietly, "is how you move 3 divisions in half the time it takes us to move 1. The interrogator raised an eyebrow. "It's not the tanks," the German went on. "It's not even the planes, it's those, pallets, forks, trucks ready before the crate hits the ground, you're bleeding us with efficiency." He let the photo fall, his shoulders sagged. "You're fighting with steel and wood and gasoline, and we are fighting with rope." Inside a signal station near Trier, a German captain read a decoded intercept that made no mention of bombs, tanks, or casualties. It simply read, "Convoy Bravo cleared depot in 3 hours 11 minutes. No delays. All pallets accounted. 7,800 rounds 105, 2,200 crates rations, 800 jerry cans fuel. Deployment to Remagen expected within 12 hours. He crumpled the page, swore. A German unit had waited 5 days for bread in the same sector. He lit a cigarette with shaking hands. The war wasn't just being lost in the air or in the hedgerows anymore. It was being lost in the warehouses, in the math. He didn't say it aloud, but the thought was clear. They're not outrunning us, they've already lapped us. On the Antwerp docks, a supervisor called for Malley's mule. Another Liberty ship was pulling in. Another load to move, another warehouse to empty. Mal climbed back onto the seat, pulled his gloves tight, and tapped the horn twice as he drove into the belly of the ship. Somewhere behind enemy lines, a German agent marked another tally in his notebook. The war was being fought with bullets, but it was being won with pallets. The snow along the Siegfried line had begun to melt. It wasn't a dramatic thaw, just a slow surrender of the earth, one crusted footprint at a time. In a clearing near the ruined village of Brandshade, Feldwebel Karl Voss of the 212th Volksgrenadier Division knelt beside a half-frozen crate of ammunition. He wedged his bayonet into the warped lid and cracked it open. Inside, instead of dry cartridges, he found 2 inches of slush and a nest of rusted stripper clips. The paper wrappings had dissolved. The wood stank of mildew and rot. It had taken 6 days to arrive, dragged from a depot by ox cart, rerouted after Allied bombers took out the bridge at Prüm. Voss slammed the lid closed and turned to his commanding officer. "They've given us waterlogged garbage," he muttered. Captain Brenner didn't answer. He didn't have to. The look in his eyes said everything. This wasn't unusual. It was normal now. The Wehrmacht's logistical miracle had collapsed into a slow-motion disaster. And still, from the prisoners they'd captured near Bastogne, the rumors came. The Americans had depots that moved like factories, forklifts that never stopped, pallets that slid from ship to truck to frontline position in a single day. The Germans, meanwhile, were hauling crates on sleds and butchering horses for fuel. Voss looked out at the muddy road. He didn't see tanks or aircraft, but he could feel the war tightening anyway, invisible, quiet, and absolute. 10 miles behind the American lines, in a supply depot west of Malmedy, a convoy of 15 trucks arrived just after dawn. The drivers didn't shout. They didn't leave their vehicles. They simply parked, cut engines, and waited. The depot chief walked down the line, clipboard in hand. Each truck carried a coded manifest attached to the inside of the windshield. He read them one by one. Ration crates from Rouen, 81 mortar shells from the docks at Le Havre, replacement radio equipment from Birmingham, Alabama. He waved his arm. One team began unloading before the first truck's engine had even cooled. The pallets slid off tailgates. Forklifts turned without pausing. Racks were pre-labeled, pre-assigned. Green to the right, red to the left. Yellow crates bypassed the warehouse entirely and went straight to the outbound staging lot. No argument, no bottleneck. At 09:14, the entire convoy was empty. At 09:21, half of it had already been repacked with new orders. Outbound now, not inbound. To an outsider, it might have looked casual. To a German watching from a hillside with a high-powered scope, it looked like sorcery. That afternoon, a report crossed the desk of Oberst Ernst Willich in Koblenz. The language was precise, dry, almost cruel in its understatement. Enemy depot throughput exceeds baseline by 340% under foul weather conditions. Primary drivers, pallet standardization, pre-labeled routing zones, hydraulic loading machinery operated by general personnel without officer supervision. The numbers were worse than bad. They were transformative. In one intercepted order, American Quartermaster Corps units were instructed to rotate forklift operators every 4 hours to prevent fatigue. In another, pallet color coding had been streamlined to include nighttime UV markings, invisible to the eye but glowing under signal lamps. Germany wasn't just behind. Germany had no language for this. Their doctrine still spoke of tonnage by rail, oxen loads per field battery, mud seasons, and fuel rations. The Americans were speaking in minutes, in units per hour, in optimized gradients. In a ruined village near the Moselle, a single division of American infantry received 130 tons of supplies in a single day. everything from sea rations to 500-pound aerial bombs to tank tread replacements. The delivery arrived, was processed, and was redistributed to forward regiments within 12 hours. The commanding officer thanked the truck crews, then turned to his logistics sergeant and said, "I don't know how the hell they're doing this." The sergeant smirked. "It's the wooden goddamn pallets, sir." The officer raised an eyebrow. The sergeant went on. "One crate at a time were nothing, but stack 50 on a slab of wood with 2 slots in it, run a fork under it, spin it, lift it, drop it. Suddenly we're moving whole companies like mail." The officer chuckled, but only half believed it. Then again, belief didn't matter. The food was hot, the guns were loaded, the trucks were rolling. In Frankfurt, the Wehrmacht's Eastern Front Logistics Command, already crumbling, received a courier report marked Ultra Priority. It summarized captured photographs of American depots in Antwerp, Brussels, and Liege. Each photo showed the same elements: forklifts moving independently, pallets arranged in color-coded lanes, civilian engineers with chalkboards adjusting inventory in real time. One photo, taken at dawn, showed a forklift loading a replacement engine into the back of a half-track. The timestamp was 7 minutes after the arrival of the delivery truck. 7 minutes from dock to field vehicle. The German colonel, reviewing the images, went silent, then muttered under his breath, "We are not fighting the same species." On the docks of Antwerp, Lieutenant Malloy's forklift hissed forward into another container hold. The lights flickered overhead. Diesel rumbled. The air reeked of salt and rust and oil, but his machine moved like clockwork. Behind him, his crew stacked crates 4 high. Tire replacements for Patton's armor, barrel liners, medical stretchers. Everything moved through Malloy's hands, or rather, through the prongs of his beloved mule. He adjusted the fork height, slid under the pallet, lifted, reversed, turned. 18 seconds from entry to exit. He didn't think of it as warfare. He thought of it as rhythm. In Berlin, a final report reached the desk of Generaloberst Heinz Guderian. It contained no images, no maps, no estimates of division strength. Only 3 sentences. Enemy logistics network is modular, self-healing, and decentralized. Palletized supply delivery enables full battalion refits in under 12 hours. Recommendation: immediate reevaluation of German supply doctrine. Guderian stared at the page, lips tight. He had written entire books on mechanized warfare. He had crafted blitzkrieg. He had torn through France in days. And now he was reading about pallets. He set the report down, picked up his pen, and realized he had no words to respond with. Back at the American Forward Depot, a new load rolled in pallets of .3006 Springfield, freshly marked from Pennsylvania. As the trucks parked, the forklifts were already moving. No shouting, no hesitation. The wooden gods of war rose on steel tines and moved forward again. The German 276th Volksgrenadier Division had no fuel, no wire, no mortar rounds, no replacement boots. They had horses, frostbite, and orders to hold the line outside Bitburg. Captain Friedrich Bremer stood beside an overturned cart near the Ardennes tree line, chewing a crust of bread so hard it chipped his tooth. He didn't speak. The cart had snapped an axle the night before, leaving 300 kilos of mortar shells to be redistributed among 20 men who had already marched 30 kilometers with frostbitten feet. He watched as 2 men tried to lash the load to a tree limb, sweat rising in the morning cold. One slipped and fell into the snow, the crate collapsing over him. This wasn't retreat, this was starvation on foot. The front was no longer a line. It was a sinkhole swallowing units before the Americans even arrived. A courier arrived 2 hours later, panting from a bicycle. No new resupply, he said. Depot command rerouted everything south. Rail junction collapsed. They're trying to use wagons, but he trailed off. You know. Bremer knew. He also knew what the men had been whispering in the dugouts. That the Americans didn't run out of crates, or wire, or blankets. That their fuel cans came color-coded, full and sealed, everyone marked with a date and depot. That they unloaded entire trucks in seconds. That they didn't even walk ammo to the front anymore, they rolled it. Someone had heard a rumor that a single American quartermaster unit could load an entire field battery, in the time it took the Germans to drag a crate to the nearest hill. It was unbelievable, and yet not quite. Because the snow kept falling on German shoulders, while the Americans rolled forward. Outside Trier, a train station crackled with static as Luftwaffe field officers barked for airlift. The eastern rail yards had failed again. The rail ties had frozen into the ground. 2 flat cars derailed trying to make the turn outside of Kilburg. But the emergency wasn't just mechanical. It was conceptual. The officer on the line kept repeating it. They're bypassing us. What do you mean? I mean the Americans aren't sending freight trains. They're sending trucks. Trucks that unload in 30 minutes. Trucks that don't wait for orders. They hand off to forklifts and they vanish before we even intercept their route. The major on the other end rubbed his temples. He thought of the depot outside Metz, still cratered from last week's bombing, still trying to move shells using planks of wood and horse-drawn winches. And the Americans. They had forklifts, pallets, colored tags, machine-run depots. They were bleeding through the gaps now, not with infantry, but with velocity. In Bastogne, where the bulge had briefly shocked the Allied lines, the Americans had pivoted overnight. One warehouse had been converted into an impromptu supply hub. 40 pallets of .50 cal, 70 pallets of sea rations, 20 pallets of snowshoes, wool, and boots. A train couldn't have reached them. But the forklifts did. They slid through bombed roads. They darted between shattered rail cars. They unloaded trucks by headlamp. They stacked by flashlight. They worked in rotations. One sergeant joked they were the only unit moving faster after the snow fell. And it was true. They'd mastered movement in mud. Now they were learning motion through ice. A young German captain, recently captured near Wiltz, sat in a British tent surrounded by American crates. He had been blindfolded, marched through 2 depots, and when they removed the cloth from his eyes, he had stared in stunned silence. Then he spoke quietly. This isn't a base, it's a factory. The intelligence officer across from him frowned. Factory. Yes, the captain said. You don't fight war here, you build it. By mid-January, the Germans had no answer. They had the will to fight. They had men willing to die in frozen trenches. They had machine guns and doctrine and officers quoting Prussian battle orders. But they didn't have pallets. And they didn't have forklifts. The Americans weren't waiting to encircle. They were flowing through terrain now, faster than the German mind could reconfigure. From Cherbourg to Bastogne, trucks were clearing entire depots in 4-hour windows. One American private, when asked what made his unit faster, said it casually. You give a man a crate, he carries a crate. You give him a pallet and a machine, he carries 50. In the command room outside Mainz, a German intelligence analyst stood before a blackboard. On it were drawn 3 arrows. 12th Army Group. U.S. 3rd Armored. Red Ball Express Supply. The last one was the thickest. Don't look at their tanks, he said. Don't even look at their generals. Look at the arrows that don't stop moving. Behind him, a staff officer whispered, We've made a mistake. Near the Rhine, American engineers prepared a temporary floating bridge. Forklifts were already preloaded with supplies. Before the last pontoon was in place, The first convoy of pallets had arrived. When the first truck crossed, the first forklift followed. The last war had died in the trenches. This war would die in the warehouse. Major Bremer stared at his field map near Koblenz. All his defensive points were inked in neat black lines. Then the courier handed him the latest Allied movement report, and he saw the red arrows weren't attacking the front. They were outpacing it. Not with tanks, with inventory. He dropped the map, sat back, and thought not of battle but of crates. In Antwerp, the Forklifts kept moving. Mal's mule now had a bent fender and 2 bullet holes in its roll cage, shrapnel from a V2 that hit 2 blocks east. He still drove it. The diesel still fired on the first pull. The pallets still rolled. As Mally guided the forks under another stack, a corporal shouted, "You realize we've moved a whole regiment's gear since breakfast?" Mally laughed. "Brother," he said, "we're just getting warmed up." The night sky over Remagen held no stars, just fog, ash, and the faint glint of steel columns pushing toward the river. American engineers whispered over blueprints by lamplight. Trucks lined up on the western bank, headlights blacked out, engines idling like predators ready to pounce. Inside one of those trucks, a private leaned back against a load of rations and wiped sweat from his brow. The crate beneath him had been stamped, tagged, slotted, and shipped from a depot 90 miles west not 12 hours earlier. He hadn't lifted it. No one had. A machine had done that, 2 steel forks under a pine pallet, 1 smooth lift, 1 rotation, 1 slam onto the bed. That was all it took. The bridge would be crossed by dawn. Supplies were already ahead of the rifle barrels. On the eastern bank, what remained of the Wehrmacht wasn't even waiting. They were digging. They were praying. They were looking over their shoulders, not just for tanks or planes, but for trucks, for forklifts, for that unrelenting sound of wooden skids dragging through victory like a silent artillery barrage. Generalfeldmarschall Walter Model stood inside a stone manor house south of Bonn, staring at a wall map. Red arrows curved toward the Rhine. He had drawn them himself hours earlier, but now they felt irrelevant. The lines were collapsing before they even formed. His divisions were reporting encirclement without ever seeing a tank. Bridges lost without bombs being dropped. Rear echelons gone cold, fuel caches dry, ammunition forgotten in depots that had never even been contacted. He turned to his aide, a younger officer who had once served in the Afrika Korps. "They're already across the river," Model said. The aide looked puzzled. "No reports yet, sir." Model shook his head slowly. "Not with tanks, with boxes." He let the silence stretch. "I've spent 30 years fighting the wrong question. We thought the rifle would decide the war, then the tank, then the plane, but they weren't looking at us anymore. They were looking past us." At a command post outside Cologne, Oberst Martin Kruger opened his final field report. The words were typed cleanly, in triplicate. He read it twice. Then he removed his gloves and scribbled a single line in pencil beneath the last paragraph. "They are not just supplying the front. They are moving the front itself." In a warehouse that used to be a rail depot near Aachen, the last remaining Wehrmacht quartermaster watched as 2 of his men tried to maneuver a broken axle under a crate of mortar shells. They had no jack, no fork, just rope and a lever. It took them 20 minutes to shift the crate 2 meters. He sat down on a crate and buried his face in his hands. They could still shoot, still fight, but they couldn't move. And what could not move could not win. At Antwerp, Mally backed his mule onto a steel ramp. The port had moved 35,000 tons that week. He didn't know the number, didn't need to. He could feel it in the way the depot never slowed down, the way the men talked more about axle grease than enemy bullets, the way forklifts darted like worker ants, never colliding, always loading, always pushing. A corporal jogged up, clipboard in hand. "We just got word. Eisenhower wants another 300 tons moved before noon. Malloy didn't blink. Tell Ike he's late, we're already halfway through it. On the floor of the Reich Chancellery, the final report arrived in a sealed envelope. It was titled, Operational Summary, Allied Logistical Rate of Advance. Category, Continuous Mobile Supply Doctrine. It had one sentence underlined 3 times. The Allies are no longer marching, they are being delivered. The war ended not in a field or on a beach, or with a signature on paper. It ended in a warehouse, in the hum of forklifts, in the thunder of pallets slamming onto truck beds, in the whistle of a convoy leaving before the sun rose, in the absence of shouting, in the silence of machines doing exactly what they were built to do. Major Friedrich Bremer never surrendered formally. He walked down a hillside road in April, coat slung over his shoulder, rifle discarded, boots ruined. He came upon an American truck convoy 6 vehicles long, forklifts already unloading before the dust even settled. He raised his hands. No one raised a rifle. One American, a supply sergeant, nodded at him, then kept marking crates. In the years to come, historians would argue over the turning points, Midway, Kursk, Normandy. But they would forget Antwerp. They would forget the pallets, the forklifts, the wooden gods of war, and the machines that moved faster than the front line.